Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, even though two of our speakers have not joined us yet. Hopefully, they will soon. Good morning. My name is Radwan Masmoudi. I'm the founder and president of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, CSID, and also a senior advisor at MPAC, Muslim Public Affairs Council. Thank you all very much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this session, fourth session of the World Policy Forum. We're here to discuss a question that has become increasingly visible, especially in the media, and increasingly misunderstood by a lot of people. And that question is, what is Sharia law? And is it a threat to democracy, to our democracy here in the United States? Over the past few years, we've seen Sharia move from an academic or theological concept into the center of political debate here in the United States. It's being discussed in state legislatures in several states, including, of course, Texas and Florida and I think South Carolina and others, and raised in Congress, where we now have an anti-Sharia caucus that has 65 members of Congress in the anti-Sharia caucus. All of them Republican, by the way, and invoked in broader conversations about national identity, religious freedom, and constitutional values. But the problem is most of the people don't know what they are talking about when they hear the word Sharia. It's completely misunderstood what Sharia is and what Sharia means. And that's the purpose of this forum. For many Americans, the term Sharia evokes a rigid legal code, something foreign and even threatening. In reality, for most Muslims, Sharia is not a state-imposed system. It is a broad ethical and moral framework that guides personal conduct, faith, and daily life. And like any legal or moral tradition, it is interpreted in different ways, also across different contexts, by different scholars and communities. So the real question is not just what is Sharia, it is how should we understand it today in a modern pluralistic society, such as the United States? How does it relate to the US Constitution and rule of law in the United States? And why has it become such a powerful and often polarizing concept in our public discourse? Today's panel is exceptionally well positioned to help us answer these questions. We are joined by four distinguished scholars who bring complementary perspectives on this topic. So we have Khalid Abul Fadl, one of the world's leading authorities on Islamic jurisprudence. We have Muhammad Fadl, a leading scholar of Islamic law and constitutional theory. Both of them are professors of law. We have Professor Ilyas Omen, a prominent constitutional scholar focusing on civil liberties, also a professor of law here at George Mason University. And finally, we have Professor Paul Heck, whose work explores Islamic thought, ethics, and pluralism. Together, they will help us to separate fact from fiction and bring clarity to a debate that too often generates more heat than light. Our goal is simple: to provide a thoughtful and informative and informed, balanced conversation that can serve policymakers, scholars, journalists, and the broader public. Thank you again for being with us. Let's begin with Professor Ilyas Omen, since he is here with us today. Should we begin with Professor Khalid Abul Fadl first? Is that okay with you? Yes. Professor Khalid, assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
How are you, Professor Khalid?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
Let's begin with you, please. If you can give us your presentation, between 10 and 15 minutes, that will be great.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Well, I'm sure as the audience knows that the issue of Sharia has been recurring now for a good decade, at least. And recently, we have seen politicians in Texas and Florida, especially Texas, run on anti-Sharia platforms. Um, uh, the critical point, though, to cut to the heart of the matter, is this begs a question: to what extent are these politicians? To what extent is the anti-Sharia movement in the United States? To what extent the states who had passed anti-Sharia bills, to what extent are they do they suffer from a Sharia knowledge deficit? To what extent is the problem that such politicians, such movements, such political momentums are ill-informed about Sharia? And I would submit to you that, in fact, uh, knowledge of Sharia is not the issue uh, in these political movements. That type of uh, ideological orientation is not healed by becoming instructed on the finer points of Sharia or on even understanding the basic uh, uh, foundations of Sharia law or any such thing. The proof of this is that when there are efforts, and I have been engaged in these efforts now for quite a while, to address the knowledge deficit on part of these organizations or on part of the politicians running on anti-Sharia bills, when you, in fact, uh, engage them and challenge their generalizations, their very stereotypical and quite prejudiced, quite bigoted statements about Sharia, uh, the response is simply to wave your discourse away as if it is irrelevant. In fact, to just simply say, go to the stereotypical position that whatever you are representing Sharia to be, it's a lie. That you are basically deceiving them or involved in some type of stealth Islamist conspiracy. The issue, in my view, is fundamentally racial. That these politicians, uh, such political movements, are ideologically very much like colonialism itself, very much like ideological orientations of exclusion, ideological orientations that define Americana in very culturally specific ways. The anti-Sharia discourse is a proxy for a racist discourse, that in its foundations does not like, well, first, it exoticizes the Muslim, it others the Muslim, it imagines the Muslim to be the other, whatever the other is. Uh, it fundamentally is premised on the Muslim being a racially and ethnically different category of person. And the very superficially intellectualized way of saying we do not want the other is to resort to quote unquote an anti-Sharia position. Put it differently. I have been a student of Sharia all my life, and now in my 60s, I haven't scratched the surface. And any specialist in the Sharia tradition would recognize how nuanced and how rich and how complicated the concept and the tradition and the culture of Sharia is. But this is neither here nor there when we are dealing with the type of ideological trope that we confront in the anti-Sharia movement. Muslims have been for long racialized in the Western imagination. Uh, Muslims have been referred to at different times in the Western imagination as Saracens, Moors, Turks, um, all which are racial designations that basically say the Muslim is the culturally opposite of who we are. And that's exactly what the anti-Sharia movement is. It is not based on any real knowledge of Sharia. It is not based on any, and in fact, uh, you notice that the anti-Sharia movement, even at the state levels or at the levels of politicians running in Texas or running in Florida, affirmatively avoid any learned texts, even those written by Western writers, even those that come from the field of Islamic studies. Let's just say uh, uh, a text written by someone like George Maqdisi, or a text written even by most basic introductory text to the field of Sharia. None of these movements have any use for this type of knowledge. I think that the sooner we deal with the fact that these ideological movements are fundamentally racist movements, they are basically, in their nutshell, avoid the excluding Muslims from public spaces, demonizing Muslims in being involved in public spaces. It's not a coincidence that while there is that every anti-Sharia movement is simultaneously, especially these days, simultaneously is also an anti-political Islam movement, is also an anti-Islamist movement, is also more specifically a demonization of the Muslim Brotherhood, uh, and a premised on or adopts conspiracy theories that American Muslim civic organizations like CARE are fronts for the Muslim Brotherhood, and even a more recent edition that I just heard from some Israeli scholars, um, that Erdogan of Turkey uh, Erdogan is himself a front for the Muslim Brotherhood, and that and that the Muslim Brotherhood and Erdogan want to restore the Ottoman Caliphate, and that the next major enemy are the Turks, because we have to fight off the recreation of the Ottoman Caliphate. These are fundamentally the movements that adopt anti-Sharia platforms. Let me just add this. I have a colleague at UCLA Law who's actually conservative. He's on the right wing of things. His name is Eugene Volokh. And Eugene Volokh engaged his conservative circles. He is a constitutional law professor, and he engages conservative circles in a more rational, learned discourse as to whether Sharia can ever be a real threat to the United States. Basically, he was talking about choice of law issues, whether it is conceivable that there is a scenario where, uh, or under what circumstances would an American court be in the business of accommodating or implementing Sharia law, however defined, and in precisely under what context, what circumstance, the technicalities of choice of law issues. And he wrote an article which he published that basically goes through the technicalities of this, concluding that something that we already know, that Sharia law, even if people enter in a contract, for instance, and they choose Sharia law as their choice of law, in other words, that they resolve a dispute according to Sharia law, or if people enter into a prenuptial agreement and there's a Sharia law choice of law provision in there, that we have in the United States a very long jurisprudence that in choice of law matters, if the law you choose violates American public policy, what in the American legal system is considered to be against American public policy, then American courts do not implement foreign law, not just limited to Sharia law, but basically foreign law. If foreign law violates American public policy, American courts will not implement it. And so, speaking to his fellow conservatives, he then basically says, I don't understand this entire anti Sharia movement because it is very difficult to conceive of a situation where an American court would have to treat Sharia law or any foreign law as supreme. And of course, as I expected, to his surprise, but not to mine, conservative circles that he was addressing this discourse to completely ignored them. Completely didn't, were not interested in engaging the finer points of choice of law matters, because fundamentally, this anti Sharia movement is a polite way, or not so polite, but basically is a politically acceptable way of saying we don't like Muslims, we want to exclude Muslims from public spaces. Racism, like Islamophobia, like anti Semitism, is fundamentally an irrational dynamic. It is premised on lack of reason and premised, it's founded on intentional ignorance. And with this type of problem, shaming is, in my view, to expose and to shame racism for what it is the most effective way of trying to counter racism. I will close with this. I don't think any of those involved in the anti-Sharia movements or those politicians who run on anti-Sharia platforms, I don't think that any of them are seriously worried about choice of law matters in matters of family law, for instance. I don't think any of them lose sleep as to whether Muslims are going to inherit one another according to the specific details of Islamic law versus what would normally happen under normal inheritance situations. I don't think any of them are in any serious way concerned about how interest rates are compounded or whether how uh, uh, lost profits in a contract dispute are calculated. Sort of the technical points that usually we see choice of law matters, where there's an economic dispute and they say, well, the way we calculate interest is in the following fashion. What you often hear are things that have no place in law, like, for instance, talking about jihad and talking about Islamic government and talking about the caliphate, uh, things that rationally do not follow from choice of law matters. Often, the whole purpose of the anti-Sharia discourse is to create dread, basic irrational fear, as if this 1% of the population, even if we assume that this 1% are some type of rabid anti-constitutional zealots, who will take seriously the idea that this 1% can overthrow and the US Constitution, even if they wanted to? It's fundamentally an irrational premise. Imagine, if you turn the tables, imagine a Muslim country with a 1% population of Christians, for instance, starting to beat the drums on the danger posed by this 1% to an Islamic state. Anyone would immediately say, that's a red herring. You are using this as an excuse to persecute a minority. Yet that simple, obvious logic, when it comes to the US and anti-Sharia, you rarely find it raised. You rarely find the dynamics of shaming, of saying, what are you talking about? You are clearly trying to persecute a tiny minority in your midst. And we have to recognize that as Muslims, we are a tiny minority in a country like the United States. I think more recently, as we hear, as we see states like Texas and Florida designate CARE as a terrorist organization, as we hear the drumbeats being beat about CARE being a front for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an absurd proposition and an absurd argument, and that the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah are somehow all bundled together in one bundle that contains not just Hamas, Hezbollah, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ottoman Empire, and Sharia, and political Islam, and all Islamists, basically all representing what is bad and what is foreign and what creates dread in the Western mind, in the same way that the Turk, the Saracen, the Moor would create dread in the Western mind. It is time, in my view, that we call this what it is: racism, pure and simple. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalid. Please stay with us. I'm sure we will have questions following the other presentation, so please stay with us to take few questions. Our next speaker is Professor Ilya Soman. He's a professor of law at George Mason University and a prominent constitutional scholar focusing on civil liberty. Professor Soman, please.
Thank you so much. I'm obviously not an authority on Sharia law or any kind of religious law, but I think my role here is to talk about the constitutional and policy issues raised by these various anti-Sharia proposals that are out there, both in state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress. So George Washington famously said that the United States was founded to create an asylum for the poor and oppressed of all nations and religions. And early on, both he and other founding fathers emphasized that there was supposed to be religious liberty for all groups, including, by the way, for Muslims, even though at that time, of course, there were very few Muslims in the U.S., but nonetheless, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others explicitly reference Muslims among the groups that would be protected by these principles. And of course, soon after the founding, the First Amendment was enacted to protect the free exercise of religion and also the freedom of speech, both of which, as we're about to see, are very relevant to these anti-Sharia proposals. So I'll first start out by just summarizing what these proposals are and what is being advocated. In different states, it's somewhat different, and obviously there are proposals in Congress as well, but there are 3 or 4 major categories of measures which fall into the bucket of anti-Sharia proposals. One is excluding Muslim private schools from school choice programs in places like Texas. Another is barring voluntary private religious Muslim communities. That has also been a matter of controversy in Texas and elsewhere. A third is barring people from using religious arbitration, using Sharia law, even if both sides to a dispute agree. Those who want to bar to say, like, it should not be allowed. And finally, most sweepingly, we have the so-called Preserving a Sharia-Free America Act, which, if enacted in Congress, would bar all Muslim non-citizens from the United States, or at least those who are described as Sharia law adherents, which of course would include all or nearly all practicing Muslims. And I think it's very clear that all of this just about, in fact, violates the First Amendment. It violates the Free Exercise Clause, which says Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Of course, originally that only bound the federal government, but in 1868, when the 14th Amendment was enacted, it was understood to bar states from engaging in laws that violate the free exercise of religion as well. And if people are targeted and punished because of their exercise of a particular religion or because of their beliefs, that very obviously violates the Free Exercise Clause. In addition, the Supreme Court has rightly held that the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment also bans laws that target religious speech and expression. So many of these proposals would violate the Free Speech Clause as well. When it comes to proposals targeting non-citizens, it is sometimes argued, well, non-citizens don't have a constitutional right to be in the United States, and therefore it's permissible to punish or expel them for their religious beliefs. I think that's wrong because the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that discrimination with respect to government policies and benefits that are not themselves constitutional rights, if it's done on the basis of religion or other prohibited categories, it is still unconstitutional. For example, just a couple years ago, in the case of Carson versus Macon, the Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional to exclude religious schools from a school choice program. There is no constitutional right to have a school choice program, the state of Maine in this case could have just abolished the program entirely. But if they have a school choice program, they cannot exclude religious schools simply on the basis of their being religious. And by the same logic, a state like Texas could not exclude Muslim schools from a school choice program solely because they are Muslim. And more generally, if you were to take the view that the government can discriminate on the basis of religion in any program which itself is not a constitutional right, that would have dire consequences for a wide range of issues. The Supreme Court has rightly rejected that kind of idea, and for good reason. For example, you could then have a law saying, well, you're only eligible for Social Security if you're a Christian, or only if you're a Republican, or if you're a Democrat. And you can say it's because Social Security benefits themselves are not a constitutional right, but that would very obviously be a threat to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on. It is also sometimes said that maybe there's a general exclusion from constitutional protections for non-citizens. That simply isn't true, in that if you look at the First Amendment and most other constitutional rights, they are not phrased as protections for particular groups of people, but rather as general limitations on government power. And the Supreme Court has held in various contexts that non-citizens do have constitutional rights. There's some question about whether constitutional rights apply to initial exclusions of people not yet in the United States. I think they should apply to that, and the jurisprudence suggesting otherwise is wrong. We can talk more about that in questions, but at the very least, there is fairly broad agreement that for people within the United States, even if they're non-citizens, they generally have constitutional rights. For instance, if a non-citizen is charged with a crime, they have the same procedural rights to defend themselves as a citizen. If their property is taken by the government, they have the protection of the takings clause. They have to be paid just compensation, and so on. And so there is no immigration exception to the First Amendment and no non-citizen exception, and that's true for most other constitutional rights as well. There are a couple of exceptions. For instance, the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment is specifically about privileged immunities of citizens. The Second Amendment, which protects the right to keep and bear arms, is phrased as being for the people. There is disagreement in the courts about who exactly the people are, whether they're U.S. citizens or all legal residents or some other group. But whatever can be said of that right, rights that are phrased in general terms and not specifically limited to citizens or to the people protect everybody, including non-citizens. And if we were to rule otherwise, it would set a dangerous precedent in a variety of respects, because obviously Muslims would not be the only group that could be discriminated against in that way. More generally, if these kinds of policies were enacted and the courts would somehow uphold them, it would be a set of dangerous precedent, and it would also cause severe harm. Obviously, it would create a precedent for discrimination against all sorts of other religions and religious minorities, Jews, conservative Christians, many others. In addition, it would actually bolster the very radical Islamism and terrorism that the advocates of these laws claim to oppose, in that the narrative of groups like ISIS, the Iranian government, and others is that the U.S. and perhaps the West generally are the enemies of all Muslims, and obviously the enactment of these laws and their enforcement would bolster that narrative. That is why, by the way, during Trump's first term, ISIS actually praised his anti-Muslim travel ban. They referred to it as the blessed travel ban, their words, not mine, because they knew it would bolster their propaganda and enable them to get more supporters. And more generally, the idea that most Muslims are somehow a threat to the U.S. is false. It is simply not the case that there is some one unified version of Sharia law in the Muslim world. There is no single Muslim religious authority like the Pope in Catholicism, and therefore there are a variety of interpretations. And most Muslims in the U.S. do not seek to impose some kind of religious theocracy or to recreate the Taliban or the Iranian government in the U.S. Indeed, as many people in this audience know better than me, many Muslims in the U.S. are here precisely because they fled those kinds of regimes, including in some cases people who aided U.S. forces against the Taliban during the war on terror. So deporting or excluding all these people would damage our economy and society, would cause needless religious conflict, and would help the very forces in the world that supporters of these laws claim that they want to oppose. Finally, very briefly, on a couple of possible real issues that supporters of these laws have managed to raise and why those issues to be addressed do not require any kind of sweeping religious discrimination or exclusion. There is the concern about U.S. recognition of possibly illiberal judgments done under Sharia law in other countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and elsewhere, to the extent that this is a real issue where, for instance, one might recognize marriages where women were forced into them or illiberal child custody judgments and the like. There's an obvious solution. They just have specific laws, barring recognition of those kinds of judgments, whether they come from Sharia courts or any other kind of courts. But there is no need to generally bar all recognition of religious court judgments from other countries, because many of them are perfectly defensible and reasonable. Indeed, there is an interesting irony that if the U.S. were to pass a law that barred all recognition of judgments by Sharia courts, a nation that would be very significantly affected would be Israel, because Israel actually has a system of religious courts for all family status law for the different groups in that country, including Muslims who are 20% of the population. We should not have a categorical rule against recognizing those kinds of judgments. There is no need for it, and it would cause needless problems. The second issue is claims about Muslims having illiberal views or wanting to impose a theocratic system. I think the survey data suggests that's pretty clearly not true of most U.S. Muslims. To the extent that some do have those kinds of views, the proper remedy is simply to prevent those views from being implemented. We have a variety of constitutional guarantees that can prevent that. And more generally, as is noted by the previous speaker, Muslims are only about 1% of the U.S. population. Those who seek to impose a theocracy are a much smaller group. So I'm pretty confident that that group has no real chance of actually creating any kind of Muslim theocracy in the U.S., and there are many safeguards against it. The concern about terrorism is also there. The rate of terrorism among Muslim immigrants in the United States is actually no higher or maybe even lower than the general population. And again, to the extent that we worry about this, the proper solution is to ban and punish terrorism, not to somehow punish all Muslims everywhere. So more can be said about many of these issues, but for now, I'll stop, and I look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Somin. I'm sure we will have a lot of questions, so this was very informative. We now go to Professor Mohammed Fadel, who's joining us. Hello, are you Paul? Yes. Is it raining?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
My apologies.
That's okay. No problem. Sorry about the misunderstanding.
No problem. I hope I didn't miss stuff.
Well, you missed two presentations, but we'll see.
Still hope.
We still hope. We have two more.
So I could-
Well, yeah, you can sit here, or if you want to dry off first and then join us, it's fine.
It's fine.
So we're going to go to Professor Mohammed Fadel next. He's joining us, I think, from Toronto. Professor Mohammed, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you
Alaikum
for
salam.
joining us. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize
Professor-
for being a little late, the confusion about the timing and my
No,
post-op recovery, etc.
And yes, you had the surgery recently, so we really appreciate your being able to join us.
My pleasure.
So Mohammed Fadel is a professor of law at University of Toronto, I think, right?
Yes.
and leading scholar of Islamic law and constitutional theory. Professor Fadl, you have between 10 and 15 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's really my pleasure to be here. Before I launch into my comments, I just want to respond to one of the questions uh, in the chat about that's asking what is Sharia. That the person was expecting to have some understanding of what that is. So let me just speak very briefly to that. So in classical Arabic, Sharia generally meant revealed law, and this was not particular to the revealed law that Muslims follow. It was also used to describe the revealed law that Christians followed and Jews followed as well. And so there's a sort of a sense of divine dispensations over time, and the word to describe that was Sharia. In modern Arabic usage, Sharia is just generally used for law, generally speaking, right? Or qanun, etc. Now, in specifically Islamic jurisprudence, we talk about the aim of the Sharia is to understand the norms that God will judge us by. And so, according to Islamic jurisprudence, all human actions can be categorized into one of five different ethical categories: obligatory, prohibited, commendable, disfavored, or permitted. Like, i.e., there's no rule. And as a matter of just quantitative analysis, the most important category, moral category, is the permitted, right? So this is reflected in Islamic jurisprudence by the principle that there has to be specific proof in revelation to make an act something other than permitted, excuse me, either obligatory, commendable, disfavored, or prohibited. So that's the general ethical framework. Now, what my colleague, Professor Abul Fadl, was talking about in terms of the technical provisions of law, sort of what we as practicing lawyers, right, in the United States recognize as law, that is a very narrow subdivision of the Sharia. That's called fiqh. And that is a professional discipline. It's very technical, etc. But the Sharia, broadly speaking, is something what John Rawls, the American political philosopher, would call is a comprehensive doctrine, meaning that it seeks human flourishing in the fullest possible way in this life and the next life. So it's sort of, you could call it, broadly speaking, a divinely ordained way of living. But Islamic law is a very small part of that. Okay, so I hope that gives some of the people a broader idea of what the Sharia is. Now, my scholarship, a lot of my scholarship focuses specifically on questions of intersections between Islamic law, the Sharia, and democratic values. So it's not that this is an irrelevant question. There are lots of questions that Muslims debate intensely among themselves regarding the legitimacy of representative government, the legitimacy of things like constitutional rule, the legitimacy of gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. These are all perfectly fair questions to discuss. But as Professor Abul Fadl pointed out, I think rightly in his comments, is that on the right, these issues are raised not for the purpose of understanding, not for the purpose of internal reform, not for the purpose of constructive criticism, but for exclusionary purposes, right? So, for example, it's very trivial to look at any legal system whose existence is, 1,400 years and find rules that are repugnant to the sensibilities of a modern liberal citizen. That is not particularly the province of Islamic law. You could do the same thing for any religion that has a legal system, including Christianity and Judaism, obviously. So there are two ways to talk about this. First is from the internal perspective of a believing, practicing Muslim, right, who is also a liberal citizen. So for that person, it's a dilemma when that person comes across a historically established rule that doesn't seem consistent with his moral intuitions. That typically spurs attempts at reform. And we see that consistently in Islamic history, right? Secondly is the external perspective. What does one do as a liberal citizen when one encounters another citizen with beliefs that seem on their surface to be incompatible with what one understands to be the requirements of good liberal citizenship? Well, Rawls again here speaks about something called a duty of restraint. What he means by that is there's a certain presumption of good faith. And that's implicit in the idea of religious freedom. if we accept religious freedom as a fundamental constitutional value, it flows from that, what I call the non-inquisitorial or the prohibition of inquisitions, right? So the Inquisition, what it tried to do is root out secret heresies. And once you are in the position of a defendant in before the Inquisition, nothing you can say will satisfy your inquisitor, right? And that's exactly what happened in the Reconquista and in the Spanish Inquisition. Even after converting to Catholicism, Muslims will continue to be suspect in the eyes of the Inquisition. I recently taught a class on race and law and Islam in the Americas, and I was shocked to discover the Inquisition continued to practice its dark arts in the New World until the 18th century. There were still hunting secret crypto Muslims in New Spain as late as the 18th century, right? And so the anti-Sharia movement is really a continuation of a kind of inquisition of what's in people's beliefs. And it's fundamentally incompatible with the premises of liberal democracy, where we take people at their word, and we only interfere when conduct happens that is contrary to public law, right? So that's sort of what I would call the proper response to religious difference in a liberal democracy. And this is something that's universal, right? I, as a Muslim, sometimes hear religious doctrines from certain kinds of Christians and certain kinds of Jews that I find to be, wow, really, really incompatible from the premises of a liberal democracy. But that doesn't give me a license somehow to exclude them from institutional life. The only thing that authorizes me to do that is if they acted in such a way as to interfere with the freedoms of other people. And I think that's the point that Professor Abdul Fadl insists on. And I'm sorry, Professor Ilya, I can't remember his last name, I apologize for that, also insisted on it implicitly. Now, there's one point of correction I wanted to make regarding Ilya's comments. Now, he noted that the founders expressly contemplated that Muslims would enjoy religious freedom, and he said that there were very few Muslims at the time of the founding. I would like to qualify that by saying there were very few free Muslims at the time. There was, however, a very substantial number of enslaved Muslims, and it's probably clear that they did not enjoy much religious freedom at the time, and we sort of know this anecdotally through the little we know about the lives of slaves during the colonial era and during the founding era. And in this context, I really commend to everybody the book of our colleague Denise Spellberg, Thomas Jefferson's Quran. This is a very, very important book. Despite the title of the book, it's not simply about the fact that Thomas Jefferson had a Quran. It's really a deep dive about the place of Islam in colonial America and the founding, and among English-speaking Protestants more broadly. And I think what's very interesting from that book is that she shows that the place of Islam in the political culture of English-speaking Protestants has always been a marker, a deep sort of identitarian marker of division within English-speaking Protestants. So on the one hand, you have a group of English-speaking Protestants that you could describe as rationalists, Enlightenment, Islamophiles. And then you had on the other side of the divide a more, for lack of a better term, fundamentalist, textualist Protestant orientation that viewed Islam and Muslims as the quintessential other and that could never be incorporated into the polity. In fact, I was surprised to find out that Cotton Mather regularly gave sermons about the evils of Islam in the 17th and 18th century. I say surprised because I don't think there were lots of free Muslims in the Puritan colony of Massachusetts, yet it occupied a disproportional place in his religious rhetoric. And I think it's important for us to begin to think about why that is the case. And these are like some really more profound issues in the history of religion that sort of go beyond, I think, the agenda of this panel. But suffice it to say that there are certain readings of the Bible in which certain groups are excluded from the divine covenant, right? And Arabs and Muslims are a sort of exemplary or what I say, are the paradigmatic example of such a community that are excluded from the divine covenant. So you see, for example, theological writings in which Ishmael is described as a child of the flesh. His followers are slaves because of their obedience to the law, etc., etc. And so there is a deep tradition in Christian theology of constructing Muslims as the descendants of Ismail, as those who have been banished from the divine covenant. And so I think this is part of the sort of unspoken culture in which this anti-Islam is so resonant among certain sectors of the American society. It's not, as Khalid Abou Fadl, some sort of rational fear, but rather it goes to the identity, the religious identity of many Protestant groups, that Islam is this ever omnipresent threat, even in the absence of Muslims, right? Like I said, Cotton Mather seemed to have a focus on the threat of Islam, despite no palpable Muslim presence in among the Puritans, right? Because so Muslims play a symbolic role that go much beyond their actual empirical importance. And if we are going to deal with this kind of anti-Sharia movement, I think we have to really begin to talk about that more openly. It's not simply irrational racism. I think there are deep theological roots to this kind of discourse. Finally, I would like to conclude just by reemphasizing what my two previous speakers already said, that to the extent that there are particular rules in Islamic law that are incompatible with American law, right? There is no problem, because there are lots of groups and actions that take place every single day in the United States that are incompatible with American law. That's why we have something called judicial review. Congress passes laws that are struck down as unconstitutional, right? There is an ordinary course remedy for all sorts of things. Now, in our private lives, we are not subject to the Constitution, and Muslims should be just as free as everybody else to exercise rights of association, rights of religious worship, rights to enter into private contracts, right? Without regard to having constitutional norms apply to their transactions specifically, right? Now, if we want to talk about passing law that constitutionalizes every act in the private sphere, we can do that, but it can't be limited to one group and not others. So I will stop here and pass the mic back to Radwan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fadl. Excellent presentation. And again, please stay with us for the Q&A period. Now, last but not least, pleased that Professor Paul Heck was able to join us. Professor Heck is a professor of religion at Georgetown University. He explores Islamic thought. His work explores Islamic thought, ethics, and pluralism. Welcome. You can speak there or here, whichever you prefer, okay. Whatever is more comfortable.
Sure, I'll stand up. Again, my apologies for being late. In Jordan, there's a popular expression, "At-takhir fihi khair." So hopefully that's the case. And I want to salute my fellow panelists. Mohammed, I guess the last time we saw each other was in Oxford, the conference on political theology, and Khalid, I don't know if you're still there. We've never met in person, but in 2000, I don't know, early 2000s, Avram Yudovich at Princeton told me, you need to meet Khalid Abou al-Fadl. And so 25 years later, whatever it is, I'm glad that Avram's word is coming true. And Elia, we haven't met, but I've enjoyed reading your works very much. So is Sharia a threat to U.S. democracy? I'd like to shift the focus to the idea of Sharia and U.S. democracy as mutually enriching. Mutually enriching. First, all U.S. citizens have Sharia communities. Jews have their Sharia, Catholics have their Sharia, evangelicals have their Sharia, Hindus too, even atheists have their Sharia. And by the way, we Christians, when we translate the Bible into Arabic, we use Sharia for the passages that indicate the religious way of life. Shariat Musa, Shariat Masih. By Sharia community, I mean a space where religious groups can say, here, we do it our way within the rule of US law. Sharia communities, religious communities, are vital for US democracy, as noted long ago by Alexis de Tocqueville. And the research shows US mosques help strengthen US democracy. One, American mosque communities cooperate with US security agencies and socialize disconnected persons who are susceptible to jihadist rhetoric. Two, American mosques, the research shows, are places where, like churches and synagogues, Muslim Americans cultivate social trust, leadership skills, and community values associated with citizenship and civic engagement. Three, American mosques, Sharia spaces, are places where, like other Sharia spaces, Jewish, Catholic, evangelical, Hindu, and atheist, US citizens develop their moral conscience. And US democracy cannot last, cannot flourish without US citizens with a developed moral conscience. So by Tocqueville's logic, Sharia helps hold US democracy together. One example of this in my personal memory is the way Muslim Americans responded to 9/11. The terrorist perpetrators, they wanted to make it seem Islam and America are enemies. Quran and flag are somehow at odds. At first, it seemed to work. America's mosques came under intense surveillance. But then many Muslim Americans rose to the occasion. They turned to the American Constitution and American law to defend one of our most cherished democratic values, civil rights. So ironically, one upshot of 9/11 is that it showed how committed Muslim Americans are to US-style democracy. Muslim Americans know US democracy is good for them. They vote with roughly the same percentages as other communities. But, and this is the key point I want to make, democracy is not reducible to electoral procedures. For democracy to flourish, it needs a robust moral life, allowing me to trust you because I know you two are committed to the good. But it is not the state that has the role of shaping our morals. It is our nation's varied Sharia communities that have that role. And so when it comes to securing the place of Muslims in American democracy, we have to look beyond the rhetoric of Islamophobia and even beyond that of First Amendment rights. We have to consider how Sharia, the Muslim way of life, contributes to US democracy, and thus that it is through Sharia that Muslims express a mature love for their American nation. Let me digress for a moment by referring to my own Sharia community. Perhaps you've heard of the Little Sisters of the Poor, a group of consecrated Catholic sisters. For 10 years, several states have tried to force them against church teachings, against their conscience, to provide contraception coverage. This case against the Little Sisters recalls the anti-Sharia laws that states are currently enacting. How to explain it? Fear of Catholicism still after all these years? Collateral damage in current battles over the meaning of the First Amendment? The truth of the matter is much stranger. The modern state, not only the American one, the modern state, but including the American one, is a system that seeks to claim total sovereignty over its territories and total sovereignty over the souls of its citizens. How does the modern state do this? It does this by demanding that citizens choose between their loyalty to the state and their loyalty to God. In short, it asks us, Catholics, Muslims, others, to worship the state as our mortal deity. We can only be loyal citizens, according to this logic, if we hide our religious devotions. How then to express a mature love for our nation, but also make clear that our nation is not our God, as if a worldly deity? The idea that you have to dress a certain way, think a certain way, and if you do not, you're un-American, is a long-standing feature of the American story, and Muslims are the latest chapter. They're a convenient target. How are they to respond? How to worship God without being tagged as un-American? How to love America with a mature love as a Muslim? It's right to call out Islamophobia, just as it's right to call out fear of Catholicism and fear of evangelicals and fear of Judaism. It's also right to speak of our First Amendment rights to worship God according to our conscience, freely, apart from the state. But it's not enough. Pointing out phobias and failures to appreciate that the First Amendment applies to all is crucial, but it's not enough. Our shared liberty only isolates us and makes us more vulnerable if it's not accompanied by a sense that your moral circle is not separate from my moral circle. Of course, this is already taking place in so many ways. Muslims, Catholics, Jews, evangelicals, atheists, across the country, they're living and working and praying alongside one another as fellow citizens of our great democracy. I'm not saying anything new, but in light of the anti-Sharia laws, this reality, the reality of our religious pluralism, needs to be introduced more robustly into the moral life of the nation and the curriculum of its schools, not only as a sociological reality, but also as a theological reality. And that's maybe something for the Q&A. Your God is not against my God. And Muslims, as others, have so much to contribute to the American mosaic of religious pluralism, which is part of Islam's Sharia. We can talk about that. What is needed is a vision of religious pluralism, not as moral relativism, which is often how it's parsed in public rhetoric, but religious pluralism as the way we recognize each other, not only as fellow citizens with rights that protect us from one another, but more profoundly, more urgently, as fellow moral creatures bound together through deep moral bonds. Our democracy can only be what it's meant to be. Our democracy can only be what it's meant to be when our moral gaze is as attuned to the religious other as it is to members of one's own religious community. In that sense, Islam, Sharia, has something our democracy needs in order to flourish. It does not cordon Muslims off. Sharia does not cordon Muslims off from others morally. One of the hadith that I love the most, it says, Al-mu'min alladhi yukhalit an-nas wa yasbir ala adahum afdal. Right? So Sharia does not cordon Muslims off from others morally, but calls them to bring their moral convictions into the public life of the nation for the good of all. How is Sharia a way for Muslim Americans to express a mature love for our great democracy, as church teaching has been a way for us Catholics to do the same? Our democracy, de Tocqueville noted long ago, is of a kind that cannot be what it's meant to be without religion. Without the moral vigor religion injects into the spirit of our national life. One last point, it's also worth mentioning the history of Christian-Muslim relations over 1,500 years, which I've studied in great detail. The case we're discussing today has to be considered as a chapter within that larger history. That history, I've concluded after 30 years of studying in it, that history can be characterized as one of ambivalence. It can range from cross-religious solidarity to cross-religious suspicion to conversion competition. At this moment, anti-Sharia sentiment is theologically grounded in the rhetoric of apocalyptic pastors who identify Muslims as the enemy in a final end-time battle. However, this ambivalence that's characteristic of Christian-Muslim relations, to speak in Sharia language, this ambivalence means we have options, we have khiyarat. So how do these two great communities, Christians and Muslims, want to view one another going forward? Muhammad kind of referenced some of that history. How do we want to view one another going forward? And so just to know our options, we need to do more to encounter one another as fellow creatures beyond the day's politics. So to conclude, yes, to reverse the politics of fear, we need to do more to affirm the truths of religious pluralism we need to do more to affirm the truths of religious pluralism as the work of we, the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Heck. I think we've really hit the jackpot in terms of 4 excellent presentations today that are extremely informative. I have 12 questions, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to give priority to the audience. If you have any question, please raise your hand. Please be very brief, not more than 1 minute. Introduce yourself and then ask your question. We'll start there at the back. Bill.
Hi, William Lawrence, National Council on U.S. Relations, also affiliated with American.
Is the mic
on? William Lawrence, National Council on U.S. Relations. I'm also affiliated with Georgetown and AU. So my question, first of all, in response to the third speaker, I did a little math here. So there were 4 million people at the dawning of the United States, 700,000 of which were slaves, about a third of which were Muslims, which would have made the early American population about 6% Muslims, which I hadn't figured out until now. And then we can look at the evolution after that. In terms of, I also wanted to mention that the most famous Muslim at the beginning of the United States in Washington was Mahmoud Yarrow, for whom the plaque went up recently. And our friend Asma Khalid Redwan and I know, and I don't know who else knows, there's a new series on American Muslims coming out on PBS, and he's the whole first chapter of that series. So that'll be interesting.
Bill.
In listening to the first speaker, though, and I agreed with all the presentations, but it kind of got me thinking that the opponents to the view that I think everyone here has towards Sharia and democracy, and we've had 4 very different but complementary presentations here, is that the other side isn't only irrational, right? As the first speaker sort of implied. The other side has a lot of irrationality, and there's an irrational debate between irrational people on 2 sides of this debate who feed off each other in a symbiotic way. But there's also rational people on the other side. And I Googled a list of about 20, Muslims and ex-Muslims who are advocating against Sharia law, often more in Europe than in the United States. The most famous is Hirsi Ali, but there's many others. And I don't want to make this about Hirsi Ali. But I would ask the first speaker and then the panel in general, shouldn't we be engaging both with the rational and the irrational people on the other side? Like, shouldn't we be both making these types of arguments that the panel made about educating people about Sharia, while at the same time addressing those issues of racism and colonial issues and bigotry and all that? Because I don't think you can really win the argument if you're not arguing at both levels of the debate coming from the other side.
Okay. We'll take 2 or 3 questions together and then we'll answer them together. Yes, right here. Haytham.
I'm Haytham Al-Khatib, a professor of mathematics at the University of Baltimore. My first question is the real question, not whether Sharia is compatible with democracy, but whether modern democracies are capable of accommodating deeply rooted moral frameworks without marginalizing them. My second question in the US is the anxiety around Sharia primarily legal, or is it more about identity, politics, and perception? And the last question, a few seconds. To what extent is Sharia inherently pluralistic, given its multiple schools of interpretation? And does that pluralism strengthen or weaken its compatibility with democratic systems? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a third question over there.
Sure. Thank you all for this wonderful talk. My name is Nabil Mikhail. I'm a professor of political science. I'm actually also from Egypt. Originally, I come from a Coptic Christian background. And I have two questions. Because as a student of politics, I feel that there is a divergence between law and politics. So let us focus at two aspects of politics reflecting both my Egyptian experience and my American experience. I hear often that, okay, if Trump goes away, things will be wonderful for Muslims, and the anti-Sharia campaign, which Professor Khalid from UCLA spoke about early, would basically phase out or disappear. So I want you to comment on this as a case of how law and politics can mix. Second, and I'm old enough to remember President Sadat of Egypt, when Nasser died in September 1970, Sadat came and then he proposed a permanent constitution of Egypt whereby stipulating that Sharia would be the governing principle, المصدر الأساسي للتشريع. Then his actions actually were not congruent with Sharia. Like his wife Jihan, if you recall her, was proposing a marriage law that would empower women tremendously. And he coincided with Israel, and he basically moved the country toward things that could be viewed as non-Islamic. And that actually was one cause why Khalid al-Istanbuli and his entourage killed him. So do you think that Sharia is a ploy, is a political trick, is a political scheme that could be manipulated? So I hope that you can answer me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take one last question or fourth question. We'll have a second round if you have more questions, but yes.
Yes, thank you
Mr.
so much,
Sanusi.
Dr. Masmoudi. And let me begin by thanking you and Impact and CSID for gathering us in this very, very timely discussion. So I appreciate that. My name is Mohammed Sanusi. I am the Executive Director of the Peacemakers Network and also serve in the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. I really have a couple of questions. One question is basically, we can hear the professors what they are saying, and then we can look into our realities as an American Muslim communities, how to actually address this question of Sharia. I would basically, the first question came to Professor Abul Fadl, which is a very important question, is that the aspect of the education. If we are going to label those who are now against Sharia and all of these caucuses and all of that as a racist, I'm not sure that's going to help us as an American Muslim community. I believe education and also removing some of this ignorance about this, and with that kind of intention, it might be more of our interest as an American Muslim community. I have seen this in my actual service right now in the United States Commissions, which is a commission has a very conservative people that are appointed by Speaker Johnson and others. But we are going to have in 2 weeks the first ever hearing on Islamophobia. Never happened in the almost since the law was passed in 1998, which is established the commission. We're gonna have top most expert actually talking about Islamophobia, not in the United States, because our mandate is not to look into religious freedom here in our nation, but abroad. So I think we are making progress as
But can you look at both?
No, we cannot.
No? Okay.
Because the law will say no. So our mandate is to look into what's happening in the 193 countries around the world, but not in the United States, right? There is a, but the point I am trying to make is that engaging and in a discourse, trying to educate people is actually more beneficial for us. We have experience also in the first, 1.0 Trump administration when he was appointed ambassador at large, and what happened, right? And we made the right decision by engaging Tim Kaine and ask him to release the hold so that the ambassador can be confirmed and we engage him. His first trip was where? to the Uyghurs Muslim community, to Rohingyas actually, to the Rohingya Muslim communities in Bangladesh. So engagements and education, I think, is very helpful for us. So we need the professor to help us actually to increase the capacity of those who are activists in the American Muslim community to further engage and educate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, Dr. Sanusi. We have 4 questions, and the speakers, you can answer any one of them if you want. We'll just